Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Top Tog guest webinar session. I'm shortly going to be joined by Dominic Byrne, and we're going to be looking at his amazing landscape photography. He's going to be telling us all about it. Dominic, I know I have you in the wings. Good evening, bud. How are you?
Hi, good evening. Thanks, Jay. Yeah, very well, thank you.
I have a huge thank you. Guys, you won't know this. Well, you will now. I'm going to tell you. Dominic is currently working in Kazakhstan, and I believe it's midnight. So thank you so much for staying up to join us tonight. So we are sticking to the hour, guys, but obviously Dominic's been great, and he said if we run over, we'll try to stick to the hour. If we run over, he's prepared to stay with us. We've had quite a lot of questions come through for Dominic already. So Dominic, just first of all, well, thank you and welcome again to joining us. As I mentioned, you're actually a Photographer Academy member and a qualified craftsman with ourselves. Landscape is very much your hobby, your passion.
Yes, it is a passion, probably. I mean, I do a lot of different types of photography, but I guess I keep getting drawn back to landscape. It's a bit easier than photographing people. It doesn't tend to move too much, and it doesn't answer back to you. So in many ways, it's a little bit easier.
And it's actually obviously it's not your profession. I need to say that. Obviously, it's a full-time job, and you do.
It's not my profession, though.
But you're very fortunate that you do quite a bit of travel, and I know obviously your camera goes everywhere with you because we've been following.
Yeah, I think the nature of what I do get to travel a lot, and I've been lucky enough on holidays, etc., to travel some very nice places. So that is a big advantage, and you know, seeing a lot of the world, having a camera with you gives you a lot more opportunities, really.
So where did your love of photography? Where did it all start? Where did your journey in photography start, really?
My father was a freelance photographer, and I guess from the days of carrying his camera back for him as a sort of 10-year-old, using a rangefinder camera, black and white, which is probably a lot of the reason that a lot of my pictures now are black and whites, because I grew up shooting film as black and whites, and we'd go home and develop them. And I have a leaning towards black and white. I think you once you can see in black and white, you tend to favour that, really. But for a lot of years, I didn't use the camera a great deal, and I think because I was travelling, it was an opportunity to look at photographs and think, look, you want to come back with something a little bit better than just the usual snapshots, really. So it was a question of sort of sitting down, learning craft again, using digital, getting used to digital, and really most of it is self-taught, I guess, but doing something that pleases me rather than something that pleases the masses sometimes.
Well, we've come to coin a phrase here in the Photography Academy offices when we have the photo critiques. We can spot what we refer to now as a Dominic. But we know we're huge fans, and hence the reason that we've invited you to join us tonight, and we wanted to share that with you.
Well, the first image is an image of Dubai. I was lucky enough to live in Dubai for a couple of years, and sadly I lived on the first floor of an apartment block, and I would drive to work and always see the fog, and unbeknown to me there was a whole world above this fog that used to roll in, and I'd seen a few images, and it was an image that I'd wanted to capture, and I'd actually left Dubai by the time I got this one, but I'd gone back and was staying with a friend in a high-rise block at a high floor, and woke up in the morning and finally saw this site, so I, with a lot of excitement, managed to get out there and take a few pictures. But yeah, it's more of a personal image for me, really, having waited best part of 3 years to capture it. So yeah, it was a good experience. The next image again was from the Middle East. This was actually taken with an infrared camera. The textures in the sands are great, and the clouds were great, and it was just enhanced by the camels sort of coming into play, really. It took a little while to wait for them, but yeah, sometimes things come together in images, and sometimes they don't. But even without the camels, there was a shot there. I think sand ripples are always very good, and because of the shape and the texture, I think they tend to work very well in black and white. Clouds, often in the Middle East, the sky can be very bland because you don't get a lot of clouds, and again, that was quite pleasant to see some clouds, and using an infrared, it gives you a very good contrast. So it's quite nice to get the whites and the blacks contrasting against the ripples in the sand and the little bit of foliage there as well. And I say the camels really just top that off. Oops. This was a picture taken in Ireland, in Donegal, in the very north. It's a commonly shot lighthouse. It's called Fanad Head, which is one of the most northerly points in Ireland. And I've seen a lot of photographs of Fanad Head Lighthouse, but they're normally taken from the cliffs. And this, I like to try and shoot things with a personal take, and it did mean a bit of a scramble down to the shoreline. Again, I chose to shoot a long exposure here because the sky was reasonably bland, but by shooting a long exposure, it managed to bring some movement into the clouds, which, with the way the direction of the clouds were going, it actually helps bring the eye into the shots. And again, the textures in the foreground were good in as much as they had a bit of contrast in them. They had a lot of shape in there, a lot of texture. Again, shooting long exposure has given a smoother sea, and where some of the waves have moved around the rocks, you get that nice contrast in the sea again with the lighter sea. It's funny, I look at images often that I've processed, and this was probably processed maybe 3-4 years ago. I would possibly process it slightly differently now, but it's still an image that I like because, again, as with every photographer, every image you take has a personal impact on you because you know what it took, what it was involved to get that picture. You know where it was, you can remember the scene. Whereas for some people looking at image cold, it can be very different. So I think I would possibly process it slightly different now, but it is an image I'm pleased with, and does bring back some good memories. This was, again, a well-shot scene really in Iceland. Iceland is a fantastic place. If anyone's ever thinking of going there are so many photo opportunities, and it's a most beautiful country. For photographers, you'll be spoilt for choice. There's always something to shoot, no matter what the weather's like. This particular beach it's quite a famous beach. It's called Vic Beach, which is famous. It has very black sand. It's a volcanic beach. The waves. It was an incredibly strong, windy day there, and it was getting towards the evening, so the sky wasn't particularly interesting. But I think, again, because of the black sand and the sea, the streaks of the sea, I knew that there was a decent shot to be there, and really finding the foreground rock was important to get that, because it gives a line in, it gives a bit of foreground interest. I could see the shot. I knew what I wanted to achieve before I shoot, and I think that's key to a lot of these images, is actually knowing what you want to achieve before you shoot. Some people will just turn up, and I think that they'll see the scene and like the scene. But for me, I knew this was a black and white shot. I knew exactly how it was going to be processed, and for a lot of my shots, that's exactly what I'm seeing. And I know you called the webinar My Vision, and I think that's key to a lot of these images, is actually knowing what you want to achieve, what your final output is going to be when you turn up somewhere. So you see a composition that you like, you photograph the scene. You've got to be 100% sure of what your camera settings, how you use your camera, everything else. But ultimately, you've got to have an image in your mind of what that end result is going to be. And this, even if this was color, actually, it probably wouldn't have been too dissimilar, because it's a black beach, the water is white, and the sky was quite dark. So it wouldn't have been too far off a black and white anyway. But this was always how it was going to be shot.
Dominic, I'm just going to interrupt, if I may, because a couple of key questions have come through already, and I think that they're going to, knowing and being familiar with your work, I think they'll come up quite a few times. So firstly, do you favour any filters when you're actually shooting at all?
Yeah, for landscapes, I would normally use a graduated neutral density filter, which I'm assuming most people would know what that is, but it's basically a filter that is half dark, half clear. So basically, you can position that up or down within the viewfinder, so that you'll darken the sky down. Because to get the balance, to get the exposure correct between the foreground and the sky, is usually too much for a lot of cameras. So you need to really darken the sky down, whether it be 1 stop, 2 stops, or 3 stops even. You need to normally be able to do that. So with this shot, yes, there was a neutral density filter used on this one. It would probably only have been a two-stop. I couldn't be too sure on that. But this was quite tricky because there were waves, there were fairly big waves coming in, and I got very wet shooting this. And you're talking a thigh-high wave coming in, and I think the secret is whenever you're shooting seascapes or you're by the sea, it is quite a dangerous location. You need to check the tide times to make sure that you can get out of where you're shooting, but also just be aware. And if there is a big wave, just don't panic. Generally, I would say lift the tripod up, lift it above your head, take a firm stance, and take the hit. You get wet, you get cold, but you hopefully walk away from it with wet legs, wet shoes, wet feet, but your camera's safe and sound.
Brilliant, Bud. And the second part to the question that I know is going to come up quite a lot. Obviously, I'm familiar with the fact that you shoot a lot of water. I know you favour.
Yeah.
I know you favour the longer exposure. People are asking already, what kind of shutter speeds do you tend to favour to get this kind of image?
Well, it's quite different. If you go back to the previous image, which was the lighthouse, that would have been probably about a 30-second exposure because. Again, the water is very smooth there, and you've got some streaking in the clouds. But when you have moving water, and with the tide, it can be very fast moving. This was only shot, I think, at 1.6 seconds. So it's relatively slow, but it will capture the movement. It's slow enough to give you the movement in there, but it's not too slow that it'll just milk everything out. Because sometimes if you shoot that at 3 or 4 seconds, you will end up with a very different look. And again, with this kind of shot, you really want to try and catch the water going out. So when the waves come in and it's hit you, then you want to be shooting then. So it can be quite difficult because you're taking a hit from the wave, and then you've almost got to set up and wait for that water to come rushing back past you. But the next issue then you have is tripods, because on sand, you'll find that often the tripod will sink, and if you've got a tripod that's sinking because the water's rushing past, you're going to get a very blurry picture. So it is a fine balance, and it can be difficult. So to get a shot like that, you may find that you take half a dozen shots and you're going to get a lot of blurry ones because the water is a powerful thing and it will move even the most sturdy of tripods, especially with a sort of soft, sinky sand.
Brilliant, Bud. All back to you.
Again, this was in Iceland. There is a beach in Iceland that has a lot of small icebergs, for want of a better description, that get washed up. And again, a lot of photographers would have seen these images in various magazines, etc. It's a very popular place to shoot. Again, a fairly difficult place to shoot because you've got fairly big waves coming in, and if you want to get the sort of shot that this one is, you are getting in there, you're going to get wet, so you've got to expect that. And one of the other issues is because the waves are fairly sizable, although these chunks of ice can be pretty big, the waves can move them, and the waves will move your tripod again. So it's really trying to get everything really rigid, set in place. Again, this would have been, this is, I think, a 1 second exposure, so you've got a bit of latitude there, but you need to get that eye sharp in the foreground. The background can look after itself, but the eye is naturally drawn to the foreground, and the attraction for that for me was the setting sun really reflecting on that ice, and it was difficult to get there because it meant standing in some fairly sizable waves just to get the angle to get that reflection. And for me, that shot was about the reflection. The textures in the ice are lovely, but I think without the reflection, it's a bit of a lesser image really. And you'll see that one's a color one, so I can do color occasionally. This one actually is a color one as well, but it almost looks like black and white. This is again in Iceland. It's a place called Vestrahorn, which it's just a beautiful little range of mountains. And in the winter when I was there, obviously the beach is pretty much covered in snow, but there were some lovely lines coming into the little dunes in the front. And I love the fact that it's a very grey day there. I personally like the way that the mountains almost disappear into the sky. It may not be everyone's taste, but again, I'm quite selfish that I tend to photograph for me. But it's an image I like, and yeah, I think the subtlety of the tones in the background, particularly the lines in the foreground, you can only work with what you're given. I've seen images from Vestrahorn that are different times of year, and they have some great foreground. I mean, it's a beautiful set of mountains. The foreground there really was as good as I could get, and it's difficult because once you start exploring, and then if you've got to come back, you've got to be careful because you'll end up with footprints all the way through the snow, which is not ideal. So you have to sort of shoot as you move into a scene in a situation like that.
Dominic, what time of year were you out in Iceland for these images, pal?
That was in February.
Okay, because I went in November, and you usually find that because their winter's fairly long anyway, isn't it? So if you are going for a winter, like I said, I went in November, but I've got very limited. How much daylight did you have in February?
It wasn't bad. I think we were probably getting. It would have been light at sort of 9, 10 o'clock, and it would have been getting dark about 4. So yeah, it was pretty good days.
That was
really.
about the same as me.
The sun doesn't get too high, so in many ways, you've got good light for most of the day, really.
I have to say,
I don't know what time of day that was shot, but it was a very grey day anyway.
I'll have to say very quickly, I don't mean to interrupt, but Iceland, and I reiterate that what Dominic said, it's a fantastic place for anybody who loves photography to go. But Sean McCormack, who also shoots for us, our Lightroom expert, he goes out twice a year, and he goes in the winter and he goes in their summer. And he equally returns some amazing images. But I thought it was amazing in the snow. I had a fantastic time there. A couple of quick questions, and then I'm going to let you crack on. We've talked about the tripod a couple of times. Do you weigh it down at all?
I don't actually, no. But probably if I need to, in the sea, for instance, I will actually push it down and virtually hold it down, because when you're shooting on sand, it does have a tendency to sink a little bit. It's like if you can imagine when you're standing in the edge of the sea and the waves come in, if you're barefoot, your feet tend to sink a little bit. Now, if you have a tripod, you're getting the same effect, and that is sinking a little bit. So I would make sure I push the tripod down very firmly if there's waves coming in, just to try and keep it as stable as I can. I don't weigh it down generally, especially not in the water, because knowing me, my camera bag would fall off, and I'm going to get a wet camera bag, which is not ideal.
Do you use the focus stacking technique at all?
No.
Nope. Answered that.
No, I think if I was shooting macro, I would. I think really with a lot of the landscape lenses, if you're shooting wide-angle lenses, really they're pretty sharp from front to back. I would occasionally use a tilt and shift, but none of these have been shot with tilt and shift. These are all wide-angle lenses. If you work on hyperfocal distances, and I know a lot of people take out charts and they'll be sitting there measuring and calculating. Look, I mean, on this image, for instance, I would probably focus on the tufts of grass in the foreground. I'm shooting that at f13, which is enough to give me sharp depth of field right at the back of the image. So if you wanted to, if you were a bit unsure, you could go to f16. But once you start getting to the smaller apertures, then you start risking getting into an area of the lens that isn't going to give you the best quality images. So 13, 14 is normally a good area to be in. F11 is not too bad. Again, F11, you'd probably have that sharp from front to back. But I think a lot of people would often tend to focus and let the camera focus in the background. Really, if you're shooting a scene like this, focusing on those tufts of grass in the foreground is the right way to go. You'll still end up with a very sharp background.
And you've just answered my next two questions all in one. So all back over to you, mate.
Okay, thank you. Now, last year I was working in the Middle East, and I decided to pack that in and take 6 months and just travel around the UK in my old campervan. So I was at the whim of where I wanted to go. If the weather wasn't good, I'd just head off somewhere else. And I managed to do a lot of the iconic locations, which I guess, having worked abroad for a long time, I've never really had the chance to shoot. So a lot of the locations I went to are fairly well known. But it was quite nice to try and to go and shoot some of these places. This is at Durdle Door in Dorset. It's again, a very well photographed location. It was a beautiful evening, and surprising, there was virtually no one on the beach, and it was probably midsummer, late summer. So I was quite amazed at that. But again, the colours, there's a fairly muted colour in the sky. The tide. The waves come in and they do rush out very quickly. That was only shot at a 1.3 second exposure. So again, keeping it relatively short to get that movement. And it's really getting the timing right. Again, that's on the backwash, so the water is going out, and it just gives that that nice movement. Which on a sort of curved bay like that, you obviously have the dominant focal point being the arch in the background, but the water, the movement in the water just sort of brings the eye in a little bit really on that. And again, that would have been shot with an ND filter just to balance the sky, because if you're exposing for the foreground, you're going to find you're blowing the sky out otherwise. This is slightly different. This is up in Scotland. They have some tidal pools in various parts of the country, and they've always fascinated me really. These are swimming pools that fill up when the tide comes in, and then when the tide goes out, they're sort of full of salt water, and everyone's happy. And then when the tide comes in, they get fully submerged, and people have to wait till the tide goes out to swim again. I just like the lines on this. I think that it's quite conducive to a very long exposure photograph. I think the seagull sitting on the rock, which this was best part of 2 minutes, this exposure, and I couldn't believe that seagull stood still for 2 minutes. He could have nothing better to do with the day, but I like the composition. It's fairly simple, and yeah, I was quite pleased when I'd taken that. Again, it was an image that when I took it, I knew exactly what the output was going to be. The raw image that I would have taken would look slightly different to that, but it's something that, again, having that vision of knowing what you want to achieve, what you're shooting for when you start the process, your composition, and then knowing what that final output is going to be is actually a very big help. This was taken in at Spurn Point, which is, I think, North Humberside they call it now, or the East Riding of Yorkshire. I'm not quite sure what it is, but again, a long exposure. I think what quite interested me in this was I quite liked the crossing posts, although I know some people would find that a slight annoyance, but I was probably more drawn to the shadows, because you had the shadows from the sun and then you had the reflections, and it was just quite nice to have that sort of mix there. Yeah, I don't know what more to say really. I have actually flipped this image before, because I'm told a lot of people in the West, because we read left to right, would prefer to see it going the other way around, and it's quite interesting if ever you get an opportunity to flip an image like this. It does look different to the eye, and maybe for some people it sits easier one way than the other, but that's how it was shot, and that's how I've left it really. But it's, again, another long exposure, because there's a bit of movement in the sky. When you have something rigid like posts, I think it's quite nice sometimes to have that movement in the sky to perhaps, again, draw the eye in if you can. And again, the angle of the posts going out, I think it's to try and not take the eye out of the image, so maybe the eye follows the posts in and then gets lost up into the sky a little bit.
Going to jump in again quickly, pal, because the questions are coming through thick and fast, and I think we might lose track a bit if I don't get some out of the way. Metering, what's your preferred method? Are you using a light meter, or are you using it in camera?
No, I think cameras are good enough these days. Look, I think we're very fortunate with digital, because it's very rare that the user is better than the technology in the cameras. I use spot metering if I need to in the camera. What I will do is I will shoot an image. I will check the histogram on the back to make sure that it's properly exposed. If it is, then fine, you're good to go really. If I need to make adjustments, I'm confident enough to know what adjustments I need to make to get the histogram right. So I think the need for external light meters nowadays is pretty limited. There's specialist instances you might want to do that, but the spot metering on cameras is very good, or even the regional metering. I'm not sure what different cameras call it now, but they're very, very good, and I think the technology there, we should be using it. I know a lot of people. This may be a question that comes up. I often get asked, do I shoot manual, do I shoot aperture, do I shoot whatever? I actually almost exclusively shoot aperture priority. If I'm shooting landscapes, I would do that. I know what shutter speeds I want, so I will adjust my ISO and I will adjust my aperture to get the shutter speed that I need sometimes. But for me, I want to take creative control of an image, and adjusting or having control over the aperture gives me creative control over the image. So yeah, it's aperture priority for me, and let the camera do the metering. Yeah, these are very, very sophisticated pieces of kit now, and I think we'd be churlish to think that they probably aren't as good as we are.
Do you ever shoot film at all?
I do, yes, I do. Not very often these days. I didn't on my trip around the UK, just purely because I didn't really want to carry that many cameras around with me. And again, storage of the film. I didn't have a fridge in the campervan, so it would have been cold enough for a lot of the time there. But no, it's something that I didn't. I took a number of cameras with me, but I didn't take a film camera. I have done when I've gone away before. I enjoy shooting film, but again, I'm lazy. I will use my digital camera to meter the scene, and then use that to set the film camera.
Brilliant. I think most of the other questions I got at the moment are to do with finishing and software, so we'll touch on that after. So, all back to you, mate.
This was shot down in Cornwall, and it's a very popular spot for photographers. It's at a place called Trebarwith, and most people will shoot from the top of the rock, which there is a shot coming up in a minute from there. But I saw this channel, and I just thought, look, this is a great it's a great line. The textures on the rock down there were brilliant. It's really nice rock. I'm not sure what kind of rock it is, but it has a lovely texture to it. And again, we go back to the vision element of it. I knew that this was going to be black and white, and I knew that the textures would come out really strongly in black and white. And again, the long exposure to get that water channel to contrast with the rock where I can. So it was again a shot that I could see what I'd shot in RAW when I checked the histogram on the back and the LCD, but I knew it was going black and white. And occasionally you'll look at a RAW image and you know what the output's going to be. So if it's correctly exposed, the composition is where you want it to be, then you know that you've got the opportunity to do something with it later on in post-production. This was again in Cornwall. I was pointed to this location. It's something called Rocky Valley, which you park up a little lay-by, and it's a 10-15 minute walk. But you need to look behind you, and I think a lot of people possibly miss this little view. There was just a small waterfall, and I love the way that the rocks around it almost creates a heart. But it's, again, we go back to the vision of it. It was always going to be a black and white, and this was a relatively long exposure because I wanted to have the white to contrast, because it was a very difficult scene. There's a lot of contrast in there. There's a lot of lights and a lot of darks, but I'm sure we'll come on to some of the post-processing. But for black and whites, for me, black and whites need to have blacks in there. They need to have whites in there, and I think it's important. I see a lot of black and whites that are very grey. And I think sometimes people need to be quite bold with how they process their black and whites. And for me, again, this is how I like my black and whites. I like them to have that contrast, and to be very strong in the color range, or the color range, but the tonality in the image.
Dominic, for the last few images that we've looked at, is there a best time of day, or is it just? These
were actually shot probably during middle of the day almost. So I think a lot of photographers get hung up on the fact that you've got to be out in the golden hour. I think there's an awful lot of opportunities to shoot certain scenes at any time of the day, and especially if you're using long exposure photography. If you're using an ND filter, especially the 10-stop ones, which will give you the very long exposures, they can be used during the middle of the day. They can give you very long exposures during the middle of the day. And I think they've now actually opened up a lot more opportunities for photographers. It isn't very much the case of you've got to get up for a couple of hours in the morning and then shoot a couple of hours in the evening. You can really shoot all day. And this kind of scene here would have been quite a shady location. So, yeah, really, this could be shot at any time of the day.
Brilliant. Thanks, mate.
This was down again in Cornwall again. It's a place called Bedruth and Steps. It's really just again to show you that the tide, the water can be used for lead-ins where you don't necessarily have strong foreground. It's not a great picture by any stretch, but it's really just to demonstrate that the water you can use that because that water takes you into the setting sun, which then perhaps leads you up into the sky. So it's got to be generally on the backwash of the water. So getting your timing right is fairly critical. But it's about thinking and seeing the opportunities where there is moving water. There's always opportunities, and I think it's sometimes just having an eye to see the shapes that you can get from that moving water.
Gonna jump in again, mate. This particular image, would you have metered for the sky or the big rock?
I metered for probably the rock in the foreground. Again, I would have had a neutral density on there. Now, the one problem with using a neutral density in a shot like this is that you're going to really darken that rock, that big rock. So in post-processing, what I would have done is blended a couple of images. It's from the same shot, but I would have produced one image that was very overexposed, so the sky would have been blown out, and a lot of the foreground would have been blown out, and then used a well-exposed image, but then overlaid one and just brought back the detail in that rock. Because the danger is whenever you're using a neutral density, a graduated neutral density filter, you've got a line that literally will cut across from the horizon, so it's going to darken the sky, but it will darken every bit of land above that as well. So that rock is going to be very, very dark. That is one of the downsides of using a graduated filter.
Just another quick one, mate. Do you have advice on counteracting noise in long exposures?
I think, again, cameras generally tend to be fairly good on that. I mean, I don't know how long we're talking, but I would probably, if I took an image of, say, a 5-minute exposure, I don't think the noise would be too bad a level. I think once you start getting into much beyond that, then you might have a problem. But if you're going for 5 minutes, the one issue I find is you normally get a few hot pixels. Now, you can use the in-camera noise reduction. The only problem with that is if you take a 5-minute exposure, you then have to wait 5 minutes before you can take another image. So I would prefer to do any noise reduction in any software, post-processing software, but I don't find it too much of a problem. I don't do many exposures that are probably 20 minutes, 15 minutes, anything like that. So for me, it isn't a problem. But yeah, I guess for people that are doing those, you need to look at some proprietary noise software.
Somebody's just asked quickly about, obviously we're seeing, I know you're passionate for photographing water and obviously like the long exposure. Do you ever shoot the water and capture it just as a comparison, or do you tend to go for the slightly longer exposure most times?
I don't, because to me, if I capture that with a let's say a 100th or a 60th, it actually wouldn't be a very interesting image. The water, the streaks of the water, is what would draw me into that image. I think if I shot that at a fast shutter speed, it really would just look. It would be a fairly dull picture in my book. Again, it goes back to what we talked about: is having a vision of what you want out of it. Maybe for some people that would be what they want. And you look at the waterfall. If you see occasionally people shoot waterfalls at a fast shutter speed, you get a frozen waterfall. Now, to me, is that how the eye sees it? The eye normally sees a waterfall as running water, and the eye would see the water rushing out of a beach as lines of moving water. So we don't see it as a snapshot of a very brief snapshot of time. So for me, I prefer to shoot it that way. You know, others have different views on it, but I think in this instance, the lines are probably the only saving grace on that image. It's not a great image, but it's just a demonstration of how the lines can work and how the tide can work for you.
Brilliant, mate. All back to you.
This was a shot up in the Lake District. I was driving along in a snowstorm, and the light suddenly broke through, and it was a question of where can I find the nearest lay line and leg it down to the edge of the lake. But it was interesting conditions. It was blowing a blizzard, and I had, I think, a 24-70 lens on, so it was shot at about 70 mil. But I just liked, I loved the layering of the foreground, midground distance of the mountains there, and just having the silhouette of that island where the light was coming through and lighting up the water. Just to me, again, I could see the elements as I was driving, and it was like the heart rate, the heart started going up a little bit. And I just thought, look, I've got to stop. And it lasted very, very briefly. I think the light changed very quickly. I probably had about 4 or 5 shots, and then the light had changed completely, and the snow was coming down a lot heavier because it was coming towards me. But it's one of those things. I didn't even use a tripod for it, so I had to make sure that the ISO was probably up high enough, that the settings were such that I could handhold it. So sometimes you know, if you're moving quickly, you do have to think about your settings to make sure that you are at a shutter speed you can handhold. Most of my images will be taken on a tripod, so it's sometimes a bit of a rethink about your working process when you're sort of rushing down to the edge of a lake to take an image and there's no tripod. Suddenly you've got to start thinking about your ISO, making sure that you're not going to get a blurry picture, because you need to have that island in the foreground sharp. That the background isn't critical, because the layering and the snow that blurs the background, it gives it a very soft feel anyway. But I think that island needs to be sharp just to make the image. Without that island, I don't think there's a real shot there. So yeah, that was quite satisfying.
Would this been a slightly longer lens, Dominic?
Yeah, this was shot at 70mm, so this was a 24-70. I probably, if I'd had the choice, I would have taken the 70-200 probably. But the 70mm was okay. If I'd had a choice, probably would have shot it at around about maybe 100mm, and I can crop it if I need to. It was shot on, I'm not sure which camera that was shot on actually, but I was a D700. So yeah, I have the scope to crop it if I need to. I've got enough detail in there. But yeah, it worked very well, and it was. I think with a wide-angle lens, that it would have been the wrong lens by a long way. So you needed to have that zoom, also to compress the mountains in the background. Really, I think having a longer lens gives you that compression, and that makes a big difference in that shot.
Brilliant, thanks, mate.
This was up in Scotland. Everyone tends to shoot the Buckle, which is the great herdsman, and this is the mountain just up the road from that. It was a very bland sky in many ways. I was hoping to get quite a nice sunset there, but the colours never really materialised. And I looked at it. I processed this both in colour and in black and white, and it's very muted in colour. But I quite like the black and white because, again, one thing with shooting in black and white or processing into black and white is it's all about shape and texture, really. And I think that the lines of the clouds, it almost looks like a volcano, really. And just having the reeds in the water, I think there's enough going on there that you don't need the colour as a distraction almost. So, yeah, I was quite pleased with that, and it was a good evening. But it did mean standing in a lock and getting a little bit wet again, but those are the centre testers. And this is the other one that everyone shoots, so I thought I'd put one in, but just for the hell of it. But again, it's a colour image, but it's about a 1.3 second exposure, I think just over a second, which again gives that movement in the water. With waterfalls, we can go back to what you said earlier on about freezing it. If you're shooting that at a 100th or a 200th of a second, you're just going to freeze the water. If you shoot it too long, you're going to get a very, very milky, very different look. But by just creating or shooting at 1.3 or about a second, you get that nice streaking in the waterfall, which gives more of a sense of movement to me. And it also means you don't get a big mass of white at the bottom of the waterfall. So it's again a very well shot image, and it's a very popular image. But it's just really a demonstration of perhaps how shutter speed can give you the look that you're looking for. So again, it goes back to having an idea of what you want to achieve when you start out taking that image. This was shot up in the Lake District fairly early one morning. The sky didn't do anything that I was really hoping for, but it's a lovely little tree, and again, I think it's a fairly well shot tree. Interestingly, this was shot at I think f2.8, so the intention was to try and isolate the tree a little bit from the background. Now, there's an element of that happening through the colour anyway and the texture of it, but by shooting at 2.8, it just gives a slight softness to the background. I think because the distance between where I was and where the tree was, you don't get as much as if you've been very close to the tree, but it's enough to really make that tree stand out and give it quite a different feel. This is a very traditional shot from the Lake District, just again to show the long exposure, giving a very soft, almost steel blue water, and the streaky clouds, which just, I think, to add to the image. I think if the clouds weren't streaking, I think it would be a pretty standard image. But at that time of night, there's normally a lot of photographers in this location, and once the sun has gone down, a lot of people disappear. But you'll often find that some of the stronger images can be had when the sun has gone down, because you'll automatically get a longer exposure, and the sky can do some very nice things. But I think the blueness and the steely quality of that water is what makes that a good image from my perspective.
I absolutely love that image, Dominic, mate. And that was, I think you put that one into critique, and it was one of the first colour ones that you'd put in, and I think you threw us all. It's like, hang on a minute, that looks like a Dominic, but it's colour. No, it's colour.
I don't think I put that one in. I've taken a lot of that jetty, but I don't think I put that one in. But yes, I have done that in colour and black and white, but I think it does work better in colour. I have to admit it doesn't.
A couple of questions on this one then. Do you have a preferred white balance?
I leave again auto. It can be changed as long as you're shooting in RAW. I think it's easy enough to change white balance in post processing. No, I'm happy to leave it to the camera. Most cameras now on auto give a very good white balance. I do notice a difference. I occasionally shoot with people that shoot Canons. I shoot Nikons. What I tend to find is that they have a very blue look to some of their images. That may just be the LCD on the back of the camera, but there is a difference. But it's easily corrected. And again, I think on a shot like this, I would tend to adjust the white balance to just to give it a warmth or coolness that to me suits the image.
Is the staying with this image? Is the blue tinge down to the big stopper filter? Is that making an effort? Is that playing a part?
I don't use the Lee Big Stopper, and I'm told the Lee Big Stopper does tend to give a blue cast to it. I use a B&W, which is actually very good and doesn't have much of a color cast at all. So I don't find that there is any issue with color cast from my 10-stop filter. I know that some filters have different color casts. Some of them give a slight magenta cast. Some, I think particularly the Lee Big Stopper tends to give a slightly blue cast. But I don't think it's anything that can't be fixed quite easily. This was actually a very blue scene. It was that kind of time of night that everything sort of went to blue. So I may have cooled it down a little bit to enhance that, but it would have been fairly blue anyway.
Great, thanks, pal.
And I think this is the last one I have, which is again up the Lake District Brothers Water, which was a relatively early morning shoot. That was quite a long. That was 2.5 minute exposure. Really combination of the actual light, because it was quite early, and trying to get some movement in the clouds, but the clouds weren't really moving very much. But I quite liked it. I liked it in colour, but I looked at it and thought, look, again, it's a bit about shape. It's a bit about the colour, the light reflecting on the water, just the very smooth shapes of those hills and the sky. Just for me works in black and white. And unusually for this and the previous one with the snowstorm in the lakes, I've actually given it a warm black and white, which is very unlike me. I must be softening in my old age. It's almost it's almost not a sepia, but it's for some reason I quite like doing that, and maybe that's a new direction for me. But yeah, that's basically it now. So that's the
brilliant. Thank you very much, mate. Well, I've got a million questions for you, as we expected. So I'm going to leave you with the screen for a second, and I don't know how easy it is. One of the questions that came early on, and maybe I should have asked it. I think it might have even been your second image of the lighthouse. So I don't know if it's easy for you just to quickly jump back to that for us.
Yeah.
You actually, Mary, who's with us, stated that you actually said that if you were to process this today, you would probably do it differently. And she just actually asked what you think you would do differently with it. I appreciate you can't do it live, but some ideas.
I think for me, I'd probably darken the sky down a little bit. I think I'd probably darken some of the foreground down a little bit. I think, to me, the mid-ground, all the cliffs underneath the lighthouse are probably a bit light, and maybe some of the foreground is a bit light. I would probably try and dodge and burn a little bit in the foreground because the big rock bottom right, if you like, that sort of big slab of rock is quite monotonous. It takes up quite a big chunk of the image, and there is some texture in there, but I think it would possibly look better with a bit of dodging and burning just to give it a bit more contrast in there and actually develop some of the form a little bit that's in there.
Brilliant, Bud. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to leave the screen with you in case there's anything we want to refer to for a minute. I'm going to work through the ones that I have in the question panel, and then if we've got enough time, I'll have a look at some of the stuff that came through earlier today when they registered. I'm going to ask it because I think Kat will kill me if I don't. Have you shot anything in Paris? Because I think you should. I'm guessing Kat's in Paris because she's mentioned about shooting the River Seine, which I believe is in Paris, or my geography is terrible. Good point to point anybody if you want to be a bit more familiar with your work. DominicByrne.com, isn't it? To sort of get a good example on that. And Kat, obviously, if Dominic's ever up in Paris, I'll let him know, and if that's where you are, I'm sure he'll come out and shoot some pictures with you.
Beautiful, it's a beautiful city.
Excellent. Oh, I love Paris, but I must admit I shot the buildings. I'm a bit of a building freak, and albeit I shoot landscapes as well. But Paris, I did love shooting Paris. It was an amazing place.
I've done a bit of various things in Paris. It's a good place.
Okay, so we've got to talk about post-processing. Do you have any preferred software or presets, actions? What are you doing with that, mate?
I use Photoshop. I've tried Lightroom in the past, but never really got to grips with it. I think I'm probably quite lazy. Once I've learned one, I tend to stick to it. So I use Photoshop. I'm not a whiz by any stretch. I do fairly limited processing. I generally would do curves and levels. I do use a couple of proprietary plugins for some of the black and whites. I use silver effects, and I use exposure, which some images work better with one and some with the other. But yeah, that's really the crux of what I do. I used to do black and whites going back in the old days using channels, and that was a fairly lengthy, complicated process. I've started getting into some slightly more complex processing, but these images have all been fairly basically processed. It's pretty much getting it right in camera. I think you have to get the basics right in camera, and then it's easy to process an image. I think you'd be surprised what levels can do, what curves can do, maybe a little bit of dodging and burning. Again, if where I've used a graduated filter, for instance, on this one, I don't think I used a grad on this one, but if I had done, that cliff and the lighthouse would have been a lot darker. So again, what I probably would have to do is merge two of those images, and then just try and bring some of that detail back into the underexposed areas of the cliff.
Brilliant. Good. Question here then, and I'll try and pronounce it properly because sometimes these big words are bigger than I am. Do you ever lose, I can pronounce it, luminosity masks?
Well, interesting. When I just said about some slightly more advanced techniques, I do occasionally use luminosity masks. Yes, it's something that I've just started to look at. I think more for some of the architectural shots that I do. I think I haven't tried it really on landscapes, but I think that is something to look at, certainly for the black and whites. It'd be interesting to see what effects, and maybe on an image like this is something I may revisit and look at processing it in a number of different ways, but this is one that possibly I would look at luminosity masks, yeah.
Brilliant. Do you, I think you mentioned it already, so you use B&H filters, did you say?
I use B&W filters.
Sorry, B&W, sorry.
Yeah. Well, I use Lee filters as grads, but just for the 10-stop filter, I use the 10-stop B&W filter. But for my grads, I use Lee filters. I've tried others in the past, but again, they start having a color cast, and some of the color casts can be difficult to get rid of if you're using it as a grad. The B&W I find pretty good. I think there's good reviews for a number of filters out there, so there's a good choice now. I think a lot of companies are making very good 10-stop filters, and even longer now. I believe there's 15 and 20-stop filters if you want them.
So we touched on post-production. This was quite a nice question, and a question that you and I have discussed behind the screens and in our previous conversations. Leonard's asked, post-production in our camera club, it's a hot discussion. I've noticed tonight that you like to present your images with large black borders and some key lines. Is this just a personal choice? It is, isn't it?
It is, and I think it's interesting because I post images in a number of places, and sometimes I get feedback from people saying that they don't like the border. That's fine. It's a very personal thing, and I don't expect everybody to like what I do. It's something that I like doing, and I think gives a consistency on the images. There are certain instances where perhaps it doesn't work, but for the majority of what I shoot, I'm quite happy with it. To me, it makes the image quite clean. But yes, I understand that for some people they may not like it, and it's horses for courses, really.
As I said, we've had this conversation. I'm in complete agreement with you, but I know sometimes Mark and I have discussed, or you've discussed with Mark, that he said maybe tailor it back a bit, and I've argued to his face that he's wrong, which I probably shouldn't do because he pays my wages. But no, I'm in agreement with you. If I was going to be presenting these images, I'd definitely do it your way. And they're your images at the end of the day, isn't it?
You'll see that a lot more people now in the photo critiques that you have. A lot more people actually present them now with a black border with a white stroke line around them.
Absolutely. I think you've started, as I said, we refer to it as a Dominic, and I think you should patent it or whatever you can. Well deserved. So we've gone quickly through your post-processing. Do you use any plugins at all?
Well, I do. I use, as I say, Silver Effects, and I use Exposure. They're the two black and white plugins. I used to use, I think it was Noiseware, when we talked about the noise, but the only issue I have with using a noise reduction software is it does slightly soften the image. Now it's a balance. If you do have a lot of noise issues, then you may want to do that. But for me, especially if I'm shooting in black and white, if there's noise in the image, it doesn't really bother me, because we talked earlier on about using film, and if you go back, a lot of the films that we would use came out quite grainy. So if you're using a 400 film, you get a fair bit of grain, and certain films would be more prone to grain than others. I actually quite like grain in images, so it doesn't bother me too much. I'd rather have a sharp image with noise than a soft image with no noise.
Brilliant. Okay, so I know obviously you've touched on it and you've mentioned it a few times that you're shooting in RAW. Are you just shooting a RAW image, or like are you shooting a RAW and a JPEG and having your JPEG as black and white, or are you just seeing it in RAW on your camera and you pretty much know what the desired black and white is going to be?
I just shoot RAW only. There was a time, maybe 5 years ago, I would shoot RAW and JPEG, but I'm not really sure why I ever did that. It was explained to me once. I was asked a question why I did that, and I couldn't really give an answer. So from that day forward, I stopped shooting JPEG. The only time I would shoot JPEG is I've shot in the past running events, things like that, where you're shooting a high volume of shots. Now that, if you're shooting even for the end user, if you're shooting high quality JPEGs, more than good enough. But for what I shoot, landscapes, no, I want the best possible quality. I want the best possible information that I can use when I process that image. So really, it has to be raw.
Yeah, and I'll counter. I'll agree with that completely. With anything that we do photography-wise, that we're always shooting raw, and the only time that we shoot a JPEG as well, pretty much now, is in demonstrations. So we'll be shooting the raw and the JPEG at a live event, so we can show possibly in that extent the straight away the difference between color and black and white. But raw every time. Are you bracketing at all when you shoot?
I don't generally know. I may do if there is a really huge contrast in a scene, but I don't like to blend images, and you often find that a lot of competitions now actually have stopped the use of blending. That it has to be one image. So I think if you expose correctly for an image, you can normally get that information out. So by a process of maybe changing the exposure on the same image and then blending those images, I would tend to do that rather than bracketing. I have dabbled with HDR in the past, but if I did HDR, I would hope to have done it at a level that people wouldn't recognize it's HDR. I actually think the image that you're looking at on the screen there is HDR. So that was a very difficult scene.
Okay, that's the ones from the question panel. I've got a couple I'd like to ask you that came through. Are you okay to stay with us just for a few more minutes?
Absolutely,
I've
yeah.
kept you up this long. You're happy to stay up a bit longer.
No, I'm on a roll. I'm happy. So,
Excellent. With the okay, quickly just come through. With the advent of better cameras on smartphones, do you ever shoot with your phone rather than your cameras?
absolutely, I do. Yeah, I've done it. I've done it a lot. I was in New York and I actually produced a blurb book for iPhones. So it was just called INY. And yeah, I use, and I think we had a conversation a while about this, but I would use Hipstamatic generally, and I use the black and white Hipstamatic. It gives a very stylized look, but I like that. And yeah, I use the iPhone. It's a great tool.
I've got to back that up as Dominic already knows. I'm a huge iPhone fan, but ironically, I know we discussed it previously. But when I went to New York, I shot with an infrared converted camera. I think we discussed this, and my blurb book
Yeah.
is IRNY. So we didn't discuss that before. So that was excellent. When you're over, we'll have to compare books. I think that'll be excellent. Okay, so I'm going to rob the screen back if that's okay with you, Dominic, and then I'm going to refer into my other one. I love that selfie of you, mate. That's great. What's that in the background? Tell us what's in the background.
It looks like a big fried egg, doesn't
Yeah.
it? It's actually an old volcano in Saudi Arabia, and it is in the middle of nowhere. And I walked down to the bottom of this thing, and it's quite a trek down there. And I was doing a detox at the time, so it was during Ramadan, and I took about a litre and a half of water down with me, which I drunk by the time I got down to the bottom, and it was just unbelievable coming back out of there. I got halfway up thinking I'm never going to get out of this place, but it was a hell of a hike back out of there. But it's quite an incredible place.
See, that's why I appreciate zoom lenses, so I don't have to do the hike down to the bottom. And I'm a rather large landscape photographer, so I don't do a lot of hiking, which is quite amusing. Right. Any tips on reducing the cost of taking your cameras abroad? So do you just minimize the kit, or?
I think it depends which carriers you fly with. I never check my cameras into the hold. My tripod goes into my suitcase. I would normally carry two bodies and maybe three lenses and various other bits and pieces on a backpack. Now that's a heavy backpack, and it's probably getting close to 12 kilos. It's over most of the airlines carry on, but I think the secret is when you rock up to the check-in desk is to try and make it look as light as possible and just have it on one shoulder so it looks like a light bag. I know that British Airways, this is no plug for British Airways, they're actually very good because they will allow you up to 23 kilos as carry-on. So as long as your bag is within a certain size, then you're okay. But a lot of the other airlines are anywhere between 7 and 10 kilos. So you have to sort of be lucky and chance it a little bit.
So I'm going to throw a question in then into the mix as an avid landscape photographer who hates carrying his pack and is considering a change. Have you thought about moving to any of these mirrorless systems, the smaller systems?
Not for landscapes. I have a Fuji X100, which was the first one. It's not even the S, the one that came out after it, and it's a great camera. It's a really very, very good camera, but I'm not sure it would give me the quality and give me what I would want for landscape photography. I know there'll be people that will argue that it can do that, but for me, I don't think it's there yet. The technology may improve, but it's one of those things that we decide we're going to go and photograph landscapes, and we have to carry a tripod with us. We have to carry filters. We have to carry the lenses. It wouldn't be that much lighter, I don't think, all things considered.
Well, the X Pro 1 and a couple of its lenses are considerably lighter than my 5D Mark II in the lens I was, but I'm not doing it like you are, so I'm just a keen, and I'm just getting incredibly more lazy as well, to be fair.
I think you can do it. It really isn't. I mean, just to sort of counteract what I said there, it really isn't about the kit, though. I think you can take great images with cameras that are 5-10 years old. What we have to understand is 10 years ago, the top landscape photographers in this country and around the world were taking outstanding pictures. They were using cameras that may have been cutting edge then, but they're not even entry-level cameras now. So I think people get hung up on, got to have the latest kit and got to have this, got to have that. But really, none of the cameras have idiot buttons that will compose an image for you. So it's still down to you as an individual to get the shot. best camera in the world isn't going to get that shot for you. It may make it technically a slightly better, sharper, bigger image, but it isn't going to get the shot if you don't compose it correctly and you don't meter it correctly, you don't use the right filters or whatever. So I think a lot of people do get hung up on the kit issue, and it really isn't about that.
I agree, and as we've already touched on, and we were asked the question, you shoot with your phone. Yeah, you can shoot with your phone. Obviously, you do need to, if you know what you're doing, there are all sorts of things that you can do, and you just apply your trade to what the tools that you've got. I asked you this question when we were chatting behind the scenes earlier, and I'm going to wonder if you are going to answer it or not. But it hasn't come from me. It's come from I think it was Martin, who's with us tonight. So I'm going to read it as he's asked it. Charlie Waite or David Norton, and no sitting on fence. Pick one.
It's a bit like saying red wine and white wine, isn't it? And I know that is sitting on the fence, but there is a time I would look at them, and it's individual images. I think to say which is a preferred photographer, I may prefer one image over another, but if you really pushed me, I'd probably say Charlie Waite.
See, weirdly, I might have gone the other way, but I completely agree with your answer. I completely agree. I will look at my favourite inspirational photographers' works, and you're right. So most of the time, I'm going to blow some smoke here. You've, as a photographer, before I even knew you, your work is, well, hence you're here with us tonight, is strong, but you have a style, I think, as I've jokingly referred to as a Dominic, but often I see a landscape that I love, and then I will look at the photographer and more often than not, sometimes, there is a consistency like yourself, but more often than not as well, sometimes there is that, stand away image, and I've seen that, being a keen landscape photographer, I do that with myself. I look at my own work and go, oh, I've got an amazing image there, and I've gone and shot something in exactly the same style and not got it. So there's a lot of.
I think there's an element of some people following certain photographers and almost trying to copy a style, and I think again, I look at a lot of photographs. I don't tend to follow any particular photographers. There is one photographer in America that I was familiar with a good few years back, and he probably has had a lot of influence on a lot of my black and whites. But he practices something called photo celibacy, which he talks about actually not looking at other people's work deliberately because he feels that it will influence his own. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think, whilst we all like to look at images, I think you need to be careful not to try and copy a photographer. I think it's a question of looking at an image, seeing maybe when you see an image that makes you stop and go, wow, look at that image and think, what is it about that image that you like? Not necessarily that style, but what is it about the image? There's something in there that's made you stop and go, wow, and just understand what that is, and then maybe just lodge that somewhere in the back of your mind, and then another image that you look at, and you have all these sort of things going in your mind, but without actually copying someone's style or trying to emulate. Because I'm asked, as I'm sure a lot of photographers are, can you give me your GPS location when you took that image, and what were your settings? Now, are they saying really what they want to do is go to that exact location and take the same image? If they do, I find that a little bit sad, really, because it isn't a reflection of them, and a photograph should be an extension of you. It should be as you see the world, and it isn't about copying someone else. It should be your image.
100% with you on that. It's interesting that we've talked about Iceland a little bit, and obviously as we've both been, again, I went in the winter, and I went for the Northern Lights, and sadly I didn't get them. I've got some shots of some nice green mist, but and after spending hours and hours in a field 4 nights in a row, but I'd do it all again. But it was. I wanted it to be my image of the Northern Lights. You walk around Iceland, it's a beautiful place. We walked around Reykjavik, and everywhere you see local photographers' books of these amazing Northern Lights. But I didn't want their images. I wanted mine. I wanted to come back with such equally as strong an image. I didn't. Not of the lights, but I came back with amazing images from Iceland. And you put your own stamp on it. That's why you make your own books and your things like that. You tell your stories, isn't it? And I think that's what landscape is to me. It's recording my travels, my experiences, but it is how you see things, isn't it? And then just sharing it with people.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I could agree more.
I've got what the question. We'll call it one last question because we touched on it. You mentioned that you travel with 3 lenses. Can you just tell us which ones they are?
Well, I actually travel probably with 4 lenses now, which is well, I always have a wide angle, a mid telephoto, a long telephoto. So it was the 14-24, the 24-70, and the 70-200. That would normally cover any eventuality. If I was shooting people, I knew I was going to go and shoot people, and I know we've had the conversation. I did a project in India where I shot just local people in India, but I took lights out with me for that. I think I took an 85mm, which is a great lens for portrait photography. But with the wide angle, what I've tended to do, because the 14-24 in the Nikon it has a huge front element on the lens, you can't use a 10-stop with it. You can use the graduated filters, which is an expensive option, but I have a 16-35 purely so I can use a long exposure filter on the front, a 10-stop filter.
Brilliant. Somebody's just asked me if I would quickly remind them how to find Dominic's site. I've just posted it in the chat box, but it's dominicbyrne.com. And you can find Dominic's site there, and you can have a good look at all his other work as well. Dominic and I have been chatting for quite a while now, as he said. We've known each other for a while, albeit we've never met in the flesh because you've always been abroad, so we've always been online. Well, I'm really very much looking forward to the next time you're back. You're going to shoot some film with us. So we've invited Dominic down to the Welsh Heritage Coast so we can apply his trade and shoot some video with us, and hopefully we've discussed it earlier that we'll invite some of the members along to join us on that as well, so you can get some hands-on experience with Dominic. We've also discussed, because Dominic, not only is he shooting landscapes, as he's mentioned, he's shooting people, and he does have the luxury of being able to travel a lot, and his travel photography is equally as interesting and as exciting as his landscapes. So we have discussed, it won't be for straight away, but we're going to look at doing another webinar where we look at a bit more of your travels and some of your people work as well, which I think would be really good. And I'm going to put you on the spot, and you can say no. Please feel free to say no. But maybe the next time we look at some of your landscape work, we can actually look at maybe taking an image into Photoshop, and maybe you can give them some pointers live on just sort of the processing. Yeah. And
happy to do
excellent.
that.
And again, we can do that once we've got you back in the UK. So Dominic's going to let me know as soon as he's back in the UK, and we'll get that sort of firmed up. So keep looking at the Facebook page and our emails, especially if you're a member, and we'll get something going with Dominic. Like I said, you might have the opportunity to come and join us down here in Wales, and we'll shoot the Heritage Coast. And obviously we've got the Brecon waterfalls, so we can maybe do a bit of both, pal. We'll get you down in your camper van for a couple of days. We might even get you a hotel, so you haven't got to sleep in your camper van. Dominic, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know we ran over slightly, but most people have stayed with us, and like I said, loads of great feedback. So I know it's something like 1:20 in the morning for you now. So I hope you haven't got too early a start tomorrow or today even.
No, that's fine. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
We've just for you guys to know, we run a monthly competition free to anyone. Doesn't have to be a member of the Photography Academy. This month's competition, it was actually based on our last featured webinar, which was with macro photographer Michelle Whitmore. So we have a macro image competition running at the moment. You can enter that via our Facebook page, so go and have a look there. Great 20x16 illuminite print on offer to the winner from our friends at Loxley Colour. And some people have asked, obviously I've mentioned that we've got some stuff going on, hopefully when Dominic comes back to the UK. If you're looking at photography in general, we have our workshops running here at the Trinity Studios in South Wales. We've got the Academy Week running now in June, which is an entire week of photography, but it is more about people than it is places, if that interests you at all. We have a 2-day workshop in Wedding, and we've got some off-camera flash workshops coming later on in the year. If they interest you at all, go to markclegon.com and you can find out all the information there, or drop me a line at jay@thephotographyacademy.com, jay@thephotographyacademy.com, and I'll share the information with you. Lots of great feedback coming in. Dominic, thanking you for your time, and I thank you again for what time of day it is, especially over there.
That's no problem. It's a pleasure as always.
Our next Top Tog guest webinar is on the 2nd of June, so the week after next, and we're going to be joined by George Fairburn, and he's an advertising portraiture photographer he's American, but based here in the UK. There's an example of his work there. So if that interests you at all, then the registration links again are available on the Facebook page. stage, or they will be later on this evening. And he's with us on the 2nd of June talking about his work and his experiences. That's pretty much us done, guys. So again, thank you for joining us. We're back, as I said, in 2 weeks' time with George Fairburn, but next week we've got a photo critique on. So if you'd like to take part in that, if you're a member, then the links are on the site. Or if you just want to join us to see how the critiques work, and no doubt Dominic will probably have an image in there, so you'll see what I refer to as a Dominic. So mate, good night to you. Good night to all you all. Thanks again, Dominic, for joining us, and I'll speak to you real soon, pal. Take care, mate.
Yeah, thank you very
Bye,
much.
all.
Cheers, bye-bye.